Welcome back to The Explainer. Okay, today we are jumping right into what I like to call the absolute ultimate economic balancing act. We're talking about the massive unseen tug of war between buyers and producers that quite literally determines the wealth, health, and trajectory of an entire country. We are taking a deep dive into aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis. Look, if you want to understand why economies boom, why they bust, and how they actually grow, this is your master key.
We're going to build this macroeconomic model step by step. First, decoding aggregate demand. Second, why the AD curve moves. Third, understanding aggregate supply. Fourth, the long and short run. And finally, finding macroeconomic equilibrium.
To really see why this matters, let's look at a real-world transformation. Take Vietnam, for example. Since the mid-1980s, they have boosted their economic output by an incredibly impressive 6% on average every single year. It's wild to think about. I mean, income per head was just $320 back in 1985, and by 2019, it rocketed to over $2,300. Vietnam went from being one of the poorest nations in the world to a thriving middle-income country. How? Through a huge high-tech export boom and massive surges in both domestic production and consumer spending. It's a brilliant illustration of how entire societies completely transform when total demand and supply shift.
Which brings us perfectly to our first act, Section 1, Decoding Aggregate Demand. Let's zoom in on the buyer's side of this great economic balancing act. First off, we need to define what we're actually dealing with here, aggregate demand, or AD. The word aggregate is really just a fancy term for total. It's the grand, absolute sum of everything being bought. We are lumping together the spending of everyday consumers, ambitious companies, the government, and international buyers of a country's exports, and then, of course, subtracting whatever we spend on imports from elsewhere. So, AD is essentially made up of four distinct characters. Think of it as the AD roll call. First is C, consumer expenditure. That's you and me buying groceries, phones, and, way too many streaming subscriptions. Next up is I, investment. Now, in economics, this isn't buying stocks. This is private businesses buying factories, delivery fleets, and heavy machinery to grow. Third is G, government spending, building highways, funding schools, all that public sector stuff. Finally, net exports, or X minus M. This is the value of the goods we sell to our global neighbors, minus the foreign goods we import. So, C plus I plus G plus X minus M equals our total aggregate demand, the whole shebang.
Now, what's genuinely fascinating is how different countries lean on totally different characters to drive their economies. Just look at the US. A massive 68% of its economy is driven purely by consumer spending. It's a consumer powerhouse. But then compare that to China. Consumer spending there is only 38%, but investment from businesses, a staggering 43%. China leans heavily into building capital and infrastructure to drive its total demand.
All right, now that we know who is doing all the buying, let's explore Section 2, why the AD curve moves and how demand shifts when overall prices change. If you throw aggregate demand on a graph with price level on the vertical axis and real GDP on the horizontal, the curve slopes downward. But here's the catch. It's not for the same reason a regular demand curve for a single product slopes down. It's actually because of the rule of three. First, the wealth effect. When overall prices rise, the purchasing power of your savings literally shrinks. You feel poorer, so you naturally buy less. Second, the international effect. If our country's prices spike, our exports suddenly become way too expensive for foreigners, so net exports tank. And third, the interest rate effect. Higher overall prices mean people need more cash on hand, which drives up interest rates. And those high rates make borrowing super expensive, which just crushes business investment. But let's look at the graph again. While a change in the general price level just slides you up and down that existing line, non-price factors will actually shift the entire curve. A shift from AD to AD1 moving to the right is a massive behavioral change. It means at every single price level, people suddenly want to buy more. So what causes this? Well, it could be a cut in income tax that boosts consumer confidence, maybe a sudden tech boom that drives up business investment, or the government just deciding to build a massive new high-speed rail network. Okay, we've thoroughly covered the buyers. Let's flip the script. Section 3, Understanding Aggregate Supply, where we focus entirely on the producers and the actual physical capacity of our economy.
So aggregate supply, or AS. This is defined as the total output of goods and services that producers in a country are willing and able to supply at a given price level in a given time period. Essentially, think of it as the ultimate production capacity of your entire economy at any particular moment. Now, in the short term, this curve slopes upward. We call it short-run aggregate supply, or SRAS. Why upward? Because of the profit effect. Look, in the short-term hustle, things like workers' wages and factory rent are usually locked into contracts, right? They don't change overnight. So if the overall price level of goods starts rising, but production costs stay exactly the same, producers are suddenly making a way bigger profit margin on every single item. Naturally, they become super eager to supply more to chase those profits. But as we know, economics is all about time horizons. What happens when those contracts finally expire and wages catch up? This brings us to Section 4, the long and short run. This comparison brilliantly illustrates the difference. In the short run, output is highly flexible in response to price changes because costs lag behind. But in the long run, the aggregate supply curve is a completely vertical line. Why? Because eventually costs catch up and an economy just maxes out its available land, labor, and capital. When you have full employment and all your factories are running at 100%, you literally cannot produce more just because prices are higher. That vertical line is your economy's absolute speed limit. So that begs the question, how do you grow an economy if you're stuck at a vertical line? Well, you have to physically push that long-run limit to the right. You do this by discovering or creating entirely new resources, improving education so your workforce is more productive, or inventing better tech. Take Dubai's famous Palm Islands, for example. They literally reclaimed land from the sea. By creating brand new, usable land out of nowhere, they increased their quantity of resources and pushed their long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. And now for the epic finale, where the two sides meet. Section 5, Finding Macroeconomic Equilibrium. Here it is, the magic spot, the exact point where the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve intersect. This intersection dictates the actual real GDP, the total output of the country on the horizontal axis, and the general price level on the vertical axis. Think about it. If prices were somehow higher than this point, we'd have excess supply. Goods would just sit gathering dust on shelves, and firms would be forced to cut prices right back down to this equilibrium point. To really cement how this works, let's look at a fascinating real-world mystery. Back in 2010, Ireland got into serious financial trouble. Workers faced brutal pay cuts, income taxes shot up, and unemployment hit a devastating 14.7%. But skip ahead just a few years, and they experienced a massive economic turnaround. How exactly did Ireland escape that mess? The answer is sitting right in the framework we just built. Between 2010 and 2019, Ireland managed to create over 120,000 new jobs. They did this because both of their curves shifted at the exact same time. Aggregate demand increased as the global economy recovered and started buying Irish exports again, and domestic consumer spending finally bounced back. Simultaneously, their aggregate supply shifted to the right because of incredible improvements in tech and a highly educated workforce. When both curves shift right together like that, an economy experiences incredible job growth and higher output without letting inflation just spiral completely out of control. So, what you should really take away from all this is that your country's economic destiny is dictated by this precise, constant dance between total demand and total capacity. Let me leave you with a question to chew on. If a massive new artificial intelligence technology completely revolutionized production tomorrow, making every single worker twice as fast, which curve would shift in your economy? And where would that new equilibrium land? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.